Welcome to Somebody Asked Me with Janice Case, the podcast where we take questions I've been asked in the past from so many different roles, along with questions you'll ask and we'll ask together to, learn. Along the way, we'll build our capacity to become a community of problem solvers. I'm your host, Janice Case. Let's get to it, shall we? All right, folks, welcome to episode 9 of Somebody Asked Me with Janice Case. I am happy to be joined today by our very own Melissa Ellis. How are you today, Melissa?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm good. I always love to frame it, here I am on the West Coast, Melissa's over there on the East Coast, it's Sunday morning. What I love about the progression of our relationship, by the way, is the first few times we hopped on Zoom to do these recordings, both of us were pretty much done up, right? We had our makeup and our hair, and this Sunday morning, we're both like, nope, now we're real, right? Now we're real, and I love that. I love that. We got to be real.
Everything.
And it's not even, the fact is, folks, it's been a heck of a couple of weeks, right? And I'm not even going to blame our realness right now on the pandemic. It's just real.
It's just real.
But back when I built the schedule for season 1 of Somebody Asked Me, I obviously couldn't have predicted that this 4-part series that we're about to launch in today's episode around trauma would be timed exactly at this moment in our country when our country and the world are all kind of trying to navigate a pandemic. So it is, it's just a little bit kind of surreal when I think about how that timing worked out. But talk to me, how are you guys holding up on your end?
So, I hadn't even thought about that, Janice, about the timing of this, how it couldn't get any better. Like, this is a really great time to have these conversations around trauma. And I don't want to necessarily, I guess it is traumatic, this pandemic that we're going through, because it's scary and all of that. As far as how I'm holding up, I don't think I'm doing so well.
Okay.
I'm a natural introvert.
Yep.
So the being at home part, I've been sheltering at home my whole life.
Right.
So that's not really a big deal. I voluntarily, though, made it a conscious thing about maybe 3.5 weeks ago. Mm-hmm. I decided I would only leave home if absolutely necessary, all that stuff. That part I'm not so much struggling with, the being home and finding ways to entertain myself. What I find that I'm struggling with, though, is the working from home. Yeah. I feel like that's all I do is work. Yep. And so the time that I spend at home, I guess when I was working outside of the home, it felt like, okay, well, I go to work and then I come home and I'm happy at home.
Yeah. Yep.
And now the work has followed me to my happy place. Yeah. So my happy place has now become a hodgepodge of it all. It's the hub, it's the center, and it no longer feels like a safe, quiet, solitary place for this introvert to chill out. So I'm struggling with finding, I guess, what we could call that work-life balance between the two right now.
I really love that you're sharing that. And I'm thinking, you know what, we just tapped into another COVID-19 special episode, so we're going to come back to that later offline.
Absolutely.
But because I think so many people are, and that piece that you just said about, home used to be the happy place, but now because it's also work. All right, we're going to put a pin in that. We're coming back to that.
Yep, we can do that.
All right, so let's get to today's episode. I chose to commit 4 episodes to the topic of trauma because somebody asked me both previously and recently how schools, especially because that's where my work life is, can support kids who experience trauma, because frankly, in our schools, they're seeing more and more kids arrive every day with these types of needs. So I did what I do, which is kind of go back through all of the, the people I know, the experiences I've had. And I landed on a friend of both of ours from high school, Patton, Swisher, and her colleague, Lisa Dolan, because they have a lot of experience. I'm going to get to that. But I landed on them because I thought, okay, let's use these, experts in their area, if you will, because they serve schools. But when I had my initial conversation with them, I realized, oh my gosh, it's so much bigger, the work they do. So this week's episode is actually going to focus on parents. So fast forward, of course, like I said, to the onset of our new normal, and the need around this idea of trauma has just exploded. One common plea I'm hearing from folks I know who work in agencies like social services and child protective services, etc., is to please keep an eye on the folks around you, right? Which is hard because we're also supposed to not go near anybody, but to pay attention, right, in the community. Because the harsh truth is that all of the practices that we have to take right now to keep people healthy are the same kinds of things, and you said this to some extent, that increase stressors in our homes, right? So the stress of being cooped up, the stress of not having that work-life balance anymore because I don't go to work, I stay home. The stress of not having access to enough food, the stress to not knowing if I'm going to be able to pay rent, all of this increased stress, frankly, increases the likelihood of negative reactions, right? So this week especially, again, the timing is just so surreal. Hit home for me because my niece works for the local women's shelter in the community where she lives, and she made a post on their behalf this week on Facebook. And it made me realize, oh my gosh, people who already live in environments where there's violence, as an example, are at greater risk in this moment of time than probably ever before.
Ever. Yep.
You know. So anyway, all of that to say that simply navigating this pandemic for weeks, for months, is going to result in a lot of traumatic experiences for people who maybe before this wouldn't have said they've experienced trauma, right? And we're going to learn more about that. So I'm relieved to be joined today by Michelle Patton Swisher, as I said, and Lisa Dolan. They're both social workers who are absolutely experts in supporting families, schools, and communities in what they call being trauma informed. So they're going to both, Michelle and Lisa will help us focus today on how parents can support children who've experienced trauma. And then next week, they're going to join us again to discuss how schools can support children who've experienced trauma. So with that, right, now more than ever, I know that the learning they share is going to be really important for all of us. I know there's something for every single one of us here. So let's get to it, shall we? So Michelle and Lisa, thank you both so much for joining us today. I know how busy you guys are, both with the incredible work that you're doing every day for the kids there in Spotsylvania, Virginia, where you're located. And of course, with the schedule of things that you do like this, which is a pretty regular thing for you guys. So thanks for squeezing us in. I want to start by having you both introduce yourselves, your role, your background, anything basically you feel like it would be important for folks to know about what brought you kind of into the spotlight on this topic around trauma, because there I feel like, especially in Virginia where you guys are located, you're the local experts, right? You're the people who know and who people go to, and it's my hope, of course, that we're going to share that expertise in places all over the country. So tell us a little bit about your background. Lisa, we'll start with you, and then Michelle, we'll go to you.
Hello. Well, obviously my name's Lisa Dolan. I have been a school social worker for I think 23 years. I've been in the lead school social work position for probably about 18 of those 23 years.
Okay.
And so several years ago, I was invited to participate in what was called the Wraparound Community Collaborative. I don't remember the exact words, but basically went down to Florida and was exposed to the idea of adverse childhood experiences. And at that point, I really began to kind of research the concepts of ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, and also to look into the ideas of trauma-informed care, and started really talking about to our community about what we needed to do. It made sense to me with our children, what we were seeing in our community, in our schools, and it just really, again, just resonated. Everything that I felt like I knew and felt like I needed, and gave me a way to talk about it and a platform in a way that I think was very beneficial. So I started kind of doing additional training at that point around trauma and becoming trauma informed, and kind of led us through that process. I'd say the last 3 years, our community has really kind of come on board to those ideas.
Okay.
So that's kind of how professionally I got here. Personally, I got here because I adopted 2 children out of the foster care system.
Okay.
And so I have a particular interest because I lived working with kids that had significant trauma histories and what that was like. So I have both that professional and personal interest in this topic.
No, that makes a huge difference, right? Being able to speak from that personal experience as well. Thank you, Lisa. That's a really great sense of then who you are. How about you, Michelle?
So I kind of got brought along because Lisa's my boss.
Nice.
No. Okay. I started with Spotsylvania County Schools about 10 years ago, working with the homeless population with Stafford and Spotsylvania. And you really realize very quickly that vulnerable population has many layers to it. And so we did a lot of work in our community educating folks and bringing awareness about homeless folks. And so then from there, we were able to start incorporating and infusing that trauma base for a lot of our families are encountering. And it just has kind of grown along the way with presenting at national conferences and training opportunities within our community. And then Lisa and I, probably about a year and a half ago, started working with the Department of Social Services and running their parenting group.
Okay.
And that's really where we have seen the need to educate parents on trauma, because they're carrying their own trauma history.
Yeah.
And how can we support them in our community as well.
Okay, so that's huge too. Thank you for that, because you're going to give us a nice tie-in to obviously our focus today, which is supporting parents. So before we get there though, let's go ahead and establish some basics, because some people who listen are probably going to be well versed on the things that you talk about. Others are going to say, well, what does trauma actually mean? And when you say ACE, what does that actually mean? So let's start there. And why don't we start with you, Lisa? How do you want us to define trauma? When we hear trauma, supporting kids who've experienced trauma, what are we talking about?
Yeah, a lot of time when people say trauma, they think of the actual event.
Yeah.
And I'm going to give you the SAMHSA definition. So SAMHSA is the Substance Abuse Mental Health Services program that really kind of takes the lead on this.
Okay.
And they describe individual trauma as resulting from an event, series of events, set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional well-being. So when we talk about trauma, I think we always go to it's what the event was.
Right.
But trauma is really the person's experience of that event. So when we are talking about trauma, we're talking about that person's experience. So your perspective matters.
Okay.
So, depending upon your personality, your circumstances, your previous trauma history, all of those kinds of things are going to key in or play into whether or not a certain event is going to create a traumatic reaction for you. So it's super important that we think about it. It's really the individual person. So we have a trauma trainer who talks about one size fits one. And it's
nice.
Very important in this work to really think about that, what one person experience is their experience. And if it's traumatic for them, it is a trauma experience. The other piece for trauma, when we talk about being trauma informed, we talk a lot about the idea of what has happened to you. So not necessarily what is wrong with you.
Yes.
And so in the mental health field and in a lot of the medical models, it's about what's wrong with you as a person. But in this movement, it's really about what has happened and what your experience has been as a result of that.
So what's so important about that definition and that clarification is, and I love that idea of one size fits one, is that regardless of what role you play in the life of a child in this, that you don't think about it in terms of, well, that wasn't such a big deal, or I wouldn't struggle with that, because it's not about how you perceive it. It's about how the person who experienced it perceives it. So that's an important, I love that.
Exactly.
Okay.
And the other important piece to kind of think about with that is that what the brain science is teaching us is that early childhood experiences that have trauma are much more impactful than later experiences are, because when your brain is developing, the experiences that you have when you have a trauma event actually changes the way your brain then responds and develops. So the brain science behind this becomes super important to begin to understand. So early adverse experiences that occur, between 0 and 3 are extremely significant. And we used to think kids don't have verbal memory at that time.
Right.
They don't remember. I think at some point where they don't feel pain because of all that. What we know now about the brain is that is an extremely vulnerable time for developing traumatic reactions because of how fast your brain is developing and how plastic it is to responding to those particular events that are occurring.
So what's intimidating about that a little bit, whether I'm a parent myself, whether I'm again an adult supporting a kid, whether I'm an educator, and we're going to get into the educator world next week, is that that's a tough one because it's hard to know what happened, right? Between 0 and 3, to know that things that are happening to them can have such high impact, and especially if they're experiencing trauma as a result of them, and not necessarily be able to know what exactly happened, right? That's scary. That's a little bit scary, but important for us to know, right? So there could be circumstances where we're supporting a child who's experienced trauma and is demonstrating, behaviors, etc., accordingly, and we have to be okay with never necessarily knowing exactly what happened because of the age. Okay, all right, that's really important.
The one of the things that we try to teach about this is that being trauma informed is actually good for the entire population.
Yeah.
So it has no negative impact on folks who didn't have trauma experiences, but it has a very positive impact on those that have the trauma experiences. Whereas when you approach things from more of a traditional kind of model, you may do okay with the folks that don't have those trauma histories, but the people that have the trauma histories do not do well.
Okay.
So there's no negative to this. If we approach things as if everybody has a trauma history,
right,
then we benefit everybody. If we approach it from the stance of I have to pick out the people who have trauma, then it's not as effective in that way. So we kind of work to get everybody to understand that, first of all, it's pretty typical for people to have trauma experiences.
Sure.
But second, it benefits all of us to operate in this way.
So with my educator hat on, and again, we'll get into this next week, it makes me think, okay, so it benefits all kids in my classroom if I am providing modifications for kids with disabilities, right? There's no negative impact on the kids who don't legally require it. Okay, that's a great analogy. Okay, I can hang on to that. So Michelle, why don't we, I want to have you talk a little bit about, Lisa introduced the ACE and her introduction for herself. But tell us what that acronym means again, and tell us what role it plays in the work you guys do with respect to helping people figure out, okay, who's somebody who has experienced trauma, right, and to what degree, etc. Keeping Lisa's point in mind, of course, that using this knowledge for everybody, right, versus trying to pick out who has or who hasn't. But what's the role of ACE in your work?
Sure. So ACE actually stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. And this actually came out of a obesity study back in about 1996, 1997. Kaiser Permanente did a study in which folks were not losing weight and they really couldn't figure out why. So two doctors, Dr. Folletta and Dr. Anda, got together and started putting together a list of basically 10 questions, and they kind of fall in with 3 areas: abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction.
Okay.
And from that, they had their participants fill out their document of those 10 questions, and they did about 17,000 respondents in their study.
Okay.
From that, they were able to determine about 1 in 4 were exposed to 2 categories of ACE. 1 in 16 were exposed to 4 categories. And so the premise is, with the more categories of ACE, the higher the ACE score, over 4 or more, it can negatively impact your health. Everything from heart disease to diabetes to stroke. But it also gave them a really good amount of information about what their clients were experiencing. 66% of the women experienced abuse, violence, or family strife, and women were 50% more likely than men to have experienced 5 or more ACEs.
Wow.
So all of that's pretty significant. But the other part of it is it did show there was some mental health components to it, with depression, suicide attempts, and then of course the obesity, alcoholism, drug abuse. But the interesting part about the ACE is the study didn't look at things such as community violence, food insecurity, family illness, natural disaster, involvement with foster care or CPS, homelessness, war or military deployment times, cultural or media violence, or criminal behavior in the home. So those are other things that can negatively impact
Oh my gosh, yeah.
little people.
Right.
So I think their study was really good because it really showed the information. And you have to remember, their study was on people who had health insurance.
That's huge. Yeah.
So I think that's important as well. But it also was able to give us the prevalence of ACE, not only in an insurance setting or a medical setting, but also how that translates into a school setting, that it's fairly common that
Right.
people have an ACE score of something. And you can look up ACE online,
Yeah.
and just pull up the questionnaire and take it. It has to have happened prior to the age of 18, though, so
Okay.
that's the score you're looking at. But it's a really good tool for parents also to kind of look at that for their own children, to know where their children's ACE score is.
Of course.
And it's not necessarily the things that have happened, but maybe just knowing what that number is, because the higher the number, the more propensity you have for those adverse experiences later in life, as stroke, diabetes,
Okay.
mental health, heart disease,
Sure.
those kind of things.
So let me ask a clarifying question. So you mentioned all the things that the original study didn't address in that questionnaire. Does the current questionnaire, if I go pull it up right now, does it now incorporate those, or it still doesn't? Wow, that's a lot of stuff left
10
out.
questions.
Yeah.
And it really, if you think about it, all of those 10 questions that are in there about the abuse, neglect, and dysfunction in the family, all of those other things that aren't in there are still impacting.
Okay,
A
they could
child.
fall under those 10, right? But they're just not directly called out. Is that the idea?
Some of them are, yeah. Like, community violence isn't in there, but if you have family violence, that's
Yeah.
your community.
Got it. Okay.
So
Got it.
they go hand in hand.
Okay. All right. That's really important. And to put a fine point on your point about the insurance piece, right? That's critical because usually this is a major kind of stereotype, if you will. If you have medical insurance, it's an indicator that you have a little bit more stability in your life. So to see these results from a study like that, and to realize, gosh, if you did that same thing with people who didn't have enough stability to have medical insurance, what in the world would it say, right? So that's huge. Okay, all right. So
we also do this in our parenting group. We've been giving this, and we can tell you that probably over the past year and a half that we've been doing our group, I would say, Lisa, 75 to...
I would say almost 80%.
Yeah, 80% of our group has an ACE score of 4 or more.
Well, that's exactly where I was going to go next was, okay, what about the adults who are supporting the kids, right? What's their ACE score? So let's go there. So your focus is largely with schools or primarily with schools, but you've actually been focusing a lot, just like you just said, in the last year and a half with parents, because now you're doing some work directly with the Department of Social Services there in Spotsylvania around providing parenting classes, right, for parents of kids who've experienced trauma. So with that in mind, pick up where you just left off. So tell us a little bit about how you ended up there, right, to start providing that service, and then pick up where you left off with respect to, okay, if that's the percentage of parents in these classes who have an ACE score that is higher, where do you begin, right, the work to do? Because now you're supporting people who've experienced trauma who are trying to support people who experience trauma, which sometimes can be beneficial because you've experienced it yourself, so you can, let's use the word relate. But on the other hand, it can also mean you need some support yourself, right, in order to be able to support. So first off, how did you come to provide the service? And then let's talk a little bit about the work you're doing.
Okay, so, because my personal life often collides with my professional life.
That happens to most of us, sure.
I took the class. I took the Department of Social Services parenting class. When my kids hit adolescence, I was struggling with trying to help manage, and so I took the class. And so as I'm sitting in the class and I'm working with these folks as a member of the class, I'm kind of like, wow, these people are ready to do some of the work around their own trauma histories. And yet the class was at the time a very, what we would call psychoeducational. It was about delivery of information, not about processing information.
Sure.
So after the class, I, of course, go to Michelle and go, Michelle, I have an idea. She hates it when I do that.
Not all the time.
So we approached the Department of Social Services, and the community is interested in being trauma informed at this point, and we were already doing some of the work of trauma informed, but we approached the Department of Social Services about adding some trauma informed information into that parenting class.
Okay.
And so we initially started with just 2 additional weeks where we used the moving resilience, which the antidote to trauma experiences is the idea of resiliency.
Okay.
And one positive, caring adult. So we used that information to get started. Well, in the process, the person who was teaching the parenting class had to stop. She needed surgery and had to stop. And so they asked us if we would take over the whole class, which we said yes, but if we do, we're going to run it the way we want to run it. And so that kind of morphed into much more of a process-oriented, experiential kind of therapeutic group. Yes, we still deliver some psychoeducation around trauma and parenting styles and discipline and all of that stuff, but we do it in a much more therapeutic, clinical way than what it was before.
Okay. All right. So that's a great kind of pathway then from where you were to how you got to where you are. So talk a little bit about, Michelle, talk a little bit about the who are the people who take these classes, right? Who's your audience?
Well, some of them could be involved with the Department of Social Services for various reasons, whether they are coming to class because they might be involved with CPS or they might be involved with the court system. There could be parents that are coming just because they need to learn more.
Sure.
Or you have parents that just need more because right now things are hard at home and they're not sure what else to do.
Sure.
We have grandparents that are raising grandchildren come to our group because that's, going back in time for them to start that process again. We've had very new parents. They have brand new babies and they just want to take a class to know, what do I do to be a good parent?
Right.
And so we have a variety of folks that come in. And sometimes people are court ordered to be there and they're not very happy.
Yeah.
But we can assure you by the time they leave our group, they love it. And they're making connections with other people. They've gotten something from the group. And one of the things we do on the very first night of group is we ask them, what do they want out of group? What do they want to learn from class? And it can be anything from communication styles to how to have a better interaction with their child, how to be more positive, how to set limits. I mean, it's a variety of things.
Of course.
And then at the end of our class, because our class is 8 weeks, we go over what we've achieved. But we do a lot of hands-on in our class. It is not your traditional sit down, Lisa and I sit at the front and give a lecture.
Right.
It is very much, we move around the classroom, we've made things, we play the brain architecture game, we start with a game every time we start, we are very interactive, and we also are a place where parents can come and get resources besides coming to parenting class.
Okay.
I think that's one of the things that we have found been very beneficial is we're able to connect parents back to their schools to get in touch with their school social worker or a school administrator or a school counselor if they need further assistance for their child. Because like we say all the time, no parent ever wants to set out and do a bad job. They just don't have the skills. And so part of this is helping them achieve those skills to do that. The other thing that's really cool is we have people that have taken our class twice, 3 times.
Wow.
Because they just want more information. And so I think that says a lot too, but they're wanting something. We are now at the point we're trying to figure out what to do next because we know there's something else that parents need and we're just trying to figure out what that's going to look like.
Okay. So that is, that's huge, right? Probably your biggest indicator of success is when people come back over and over again. There's just no doubting that. So that's really powerful. So talk to me a little bit about then the scope of the learning. You kind of gave some broad topics there, and I love, by the way, the design. I can already hear it. I can already envision it. You guys are already doing, excuse me, so much of what's important around the research behind how people learn, right? They don't learn when you stand in a classroom and tell them stuff, right? You have to engage them in a learning process. So it's powerful to hear that, and I absolutely love the fact that you all are there from the schools, but working in this capacity for the local Department of Social Services, like you said, you can make connections back to the schools for them that somebody else might not be able to make, right? Because a lot of this is understanding the system and how the system works. So with all that, Lisa, tell us a little bit about, if you, I don't know what your structure is, if it's, 3 weeks or 4 weeks or whatever it is, but what are the main topics that you cover and why, right? When you took this over, if you got to do it the way you knew it needed to be done, you had to hone in, right, on some key topics. So what are they and why? What are the takeaways we're looking for parents?
Mm-hmm. So the class is 8 weeks long, and we always start with, kind of that getting to know you kind of class rules. What do you want to kind of get out of, that kind of stuff. That's just good basic group management kinds of things. We show the movie Resilience because there's a huge amount of power in setting up what we're going to do with trauma and adverse childhood experiences from that. And then we always give them the ACE questionnaire where we collect their information. And then I think globally, there's some basic topics that we generally cover. We try to take this very developmentally. So we start with kind of child development. Mm-hmm. What can you expect? What's typical child development? And then what can you expect from a child who's had an exposure to trauma in those typical kinds of developmental stages? And we build from that idea of childhood development into, so what's typical for chores based on their development? What's typical for discipline based on their development? That becomes super important, is the concepts of kids are developing and what we can expect. People don't, we think that's common knowledge.
It's not.
It's not.
It really isn't. Yep.
So we do a lot of work around childhood development, and within that we talk about discipline, chores, kind of household management, and then I think the other key topic area is really about regulation. And we're talking about helping parents to regulate kids, but we're also showing parents how to regulate themselves. So there's a lot of work around, first you regulate you, then you can help your kids. And a lot of the brain science behind the concepts of co-regulation and what leads to dysregulation and how we can support that when there has been, adverse experiences and what that means to them as a parent and to their child as a result.
So, Michelle, dig into that for me a little bit. So when you say regulation, right? I think I know what that means, but let's go ahead and be clear for everyone. So this idea of, and I love, Lisa, by the way, the idea that first you have to start with yourself, right? Like you have to be able to self-regulate before you can help someone else hopefully learn to self-regulate. So Michelle, when we say regulation, what does it look like? What are some of the things that I'm doing to learn how to self-regulate?
So the biggest way to kind of define regulate is to quiet the response. So you're going to quiet the stress response. So you got to bring it down is the best way I can kind of give the scenario. So it can be, rhythmic activities like drumming, swimming is a rhythmic activity, walking, drawing, bouncing a ball, just literally bouncing a ball. Those are all regulatory activities.
And I'm doing that when I'm starting to experience a stressor, when I start, like, how do I know I need to do that?
Well, I think it depends on the person,
of course,
is the big thing, because everybody responds to stress differently.
Yes.
But if you know that you're starting to get stressed, what can you do to mitigate that? Is what you're looking for. And it can be, mindfulness, breathing activities, yoga, rocking chairs. People don't realize how much that rhythm just can slow things down. Drinking water, what that does is that slows you down because you have to breathe when you drink a glass of water. So these are always when you're trying to, bring the stress response down, you want to regulate the body. And so that's one of the things that we've talked about with parents in our class is when you become elevated, your child becomes elevated.
Right.
And you just doing the stair step, and how can you bring that all back down? And what it's doing, unfortunately, is you have to rethink about how you were parented, more than likely.
Absolutely.
And then how you're going to change that. And I will say we had great success with some of our families when they came back and said, oh my gosh, I tried that of just walking away and going in my room and then taking space and then coming back, and, or we took a walk, or I didn't engage. And those things are so important because it's going to help de-escalate the situation, but also help regulate what's going on.
Well, it's critical because our typical response in those kind of situations that lead to conflict is to get the upper hand, right? Like you said, and that leads you up that ladder that you're talking about, which makes so much sense. And I love the concreteness of some of the examples you gave, right? First, recognize you're headed up the ladder, and then here are the things the types of things that you can do in order to bring yourself down, or at least to stop the point at where you're at. So Lisa, I'm self-regulating. Okay, got it. I sense myself. Now, what are some of the key things that you talk about then? How do I help my kid, right? If my kid has kind of joined me on that ladder and we're headed up.
Mm-hmm. But we go into, and this is where I think that the child development stuff becomes so very powerful. We go into helping parents to understand that when your child is going up that, we call it the crisis cycle. So when they're going up that crisis cycle, they are basically losing intellectual ability during that process. So we teach parents about the idea of flipping your lid, which is if you Google Dan Siegel, then he's the one who kind of came up with that idea. So we actually teach them the hand model of the brain and kind of how the brain functions and what happens when kids flip their lid, which basically means all of your executive functioning goes offline.
Right.
And so, if parents can stay regulated, then they have the ability to then recognize that their kid doesn't have the verbal skills at that point to do the work, that it has to be somatosensory at that point. So I'm a big fan of Dr. Bruce Perry, and I'm taking one of his classes on neurosequential model of therapies, and he talks a lot about that frequently we try to regulate at the relationship level or the intellectual level. And the reality is when kids have flipped their lid, they aren't there. They can't do that. So we need to regulate at the somatosensory level, which is the different things that Michelle talked about, the throwing the ball, the swimming, the push-ups.
The things that don't require intellectual ability, right?
They don't require the intellectual ability, exactly.
Okay.
So we talk a lot to our parents about you put those things into your daily life with your children before the dysregulation occurs.
Okay.
So when the dysregulation begins to occur, then it's normal practice for you to say to your kid, hey, I noticed that you're really starting to kind of go towards flipping your lid.
Okay.
Let's find something to do to help to regulate. And you don't talk about what the problem was right then. First, you relate.
Okay.
And then you kind of go from there. And once they're coming back down and the brain comes back online, then we can do all that stuff that we want to do with problem solving and what would you do differently and all of that kind of traditional model of parenting. You just have to help with the regular piece first.
So dig into that part for me a little bit. So I am a parent, right? I've been in your class. We've learned about the regulation piece, the cycle, the whole idea of flipping my lid. So what part of what you're teaching is it's important to teach some of those pieces to your kid when they're not in crisis, obviously, right? Like it has to become a part of how we are operating together.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. Okay. So, and some kids who are very dysregulated need those regulatory activities during the day, just typically. Yeah. Because you can kind of be, if you've had a really significant trauma history and you think about the crisis cycle, so most of us have kind of a baseline. Okay. Well, when you have a significant trauma history, your baseline goes from being what we would expect to being already kind of dysregulated. Right. And so they need those kinds of activities. And somatosensory is the best place to start because that is developmentally appropriate. Right. So if my trauma occurred when I was 2 or 3 or even before, that part of my brain that was developing at that point is really that part of the brain that's going to respond to somatosensory activities. It's not going to respond to verbal and redirection and all of that. So if I'm meeting the brain where the need is, then I can repair skills within that. We call it lagging skills. So we can repair some of those things and get to a better place. It's harder to develop later than it is early, but it's possible to do it. Our brain is wonderfully plastic.
So I think the thing in my head now then is, as I'm listening to you talk, I'm thinking about what you said earlier, which is that being trauma informed is good for everybody. And so as I'm thinking about your audience of parents right now, I think about the spectrum, like you said, sometimes you just have new parents who just want to, before they get there with their kids, they want to know stuff, right? And you have the whole spectrum. And I'm thinking to myself, so whether my kid has an ACE score or not, right? That what I hear you describing are good things to make a part of how we go about our family life together. And I am thinking about the fact that we're all sequestered in our homes right now. And I'm thinking to myself, oh my gosh, one thing I haven't thought of myself, and I do live videos on Facebook and stuff all the time, and I've done a couple now about like the whole give yourself a break about the teaching thing, right? You're not all magically going to be teachers in your homes now. But I haven't thought about this piece. How are you building in some self-regulatory opportunities for your kids? Because of course they're going stir crazy. You're going stir crazy. So just the incredible kind of balance that you create in a family and a home by building it in. Right? Just making it a part of what you do.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
I think one of the most powerful kinds of, I don't know what you would call it, but themes that we give parents is when you think about how do you soothe an infant. You rock an infant when you're soothing. Of course, you check and make sure they're clean and they fed and all those kind of basic needs. So you're building on Maslow. So the same kind of idea happens right now with everything that's going on in our world. We need to make sure our kids are clean, that they are eating, that they're getting the sleep that they need. There's all of those kinds of meeting the basic needs. But then the next piece of that is helping them to regulate. So when babies are little, we're in charge of regulation for them. And then we grow to co-regulate with them. Well, the reality is right now in our world, we've all kind of lost some developmental skills because we're in crisis.
Exactly.
So we've all kind of reverted back to an earlier level of development. So particularly right now with the crisis that we're all experiencing, the pandemic, the idea really is that all children, are going to lose skills right now because stress tends to do that to you. You revert to a lower level of development. That makes sense, I think, to most people. So if you think about right now, so I have a 15-year-old right now. So she's not functioning as a typical 15-year-old in this time. Her brain is overstressed. So if she's functioning like a 5-year-old, and I can respond to and help co-regulate her and meet those needs, then I'm building on those particular skills. So you build in the activities that you know will help co-regulate kids as a result of that during your day. So, with an infant, what's our best kind of action plan is routine and structure.
Right.
So right now, your best action plan with your kids, and it works all the time, but right now in high stress area is routine and structure. And then the next area that we have to meet after we've met basic needs is that somatosensory place. So the patterned rhythm movement. So when we're soothing young kids, we rock them, we cuddle them, we soothe them. Well, a 15-year-old might not let me rock her or cuddle her, but she will let me make sure she has comfy blankets. She will let me say, let's go for a walk, or some of those kinds of activities that are soothing to that part of your brain.
Okay.
So really building in those activities, anything that's patterned, rhythmic, and movement related right now are going to be very pull down that dysregulated stress response.
I like that. Okay, so pattern, rhythmic, soothing, and we'll put some resources in the episode notes here, some websites you can go to that direct you to some of these resources. So we'll build it out from there as well. And I appreciate, Lisa, you distinguishing between the young, right, with the really, really young, all the way from infant all the way up to my teenagers, right? What's going to be not even, I was about to say appropriate, but it's not so much about appropriate as effective, right? It's going to be different based on their needs. And so important, folks, for us to really be thinking in terms of this idea that being in situations of stress it really have an impact on our capacity to engage intellectually, right? And we don't often think about that. We only think about the emotions taking over, but not really thinking about it in terms of the emotions are taking over in part because the intellectual capacity, the area of the brain, as you're talking about, Lisa, that we're tracking is changing. And so being able to meet our kids where they are, and in some cases, we don't even necessarily know what the source of the stress is. Right now, in this moment in time, we do. There's a pandemic, right? Makes it kind of simple. But in lots of cases, right, it's the whole, again, whether my kid has an ACE score or not, they come home over the top, they flip their lid, right? Just for whatever mundane thing. I have a 12-year-old and, she's in 7th grade and that means girl drama. So, plenty of days that she comes home and I have no idea what the heck happened. But to be able to say, okay, regardless of what happened, here's where she is and here's how I can meet her where she is and help her kind of get back to actually being able to speak words, that I can track and understand and eventually support her on. So, yeah.
We don't necessarily need to know what the trauma was.
Yeah.
You just need to recognize something's going on with this kid.
Yeah.
And I can help regulate them. It's almost a coaching model. So as when they're infants and we're rocking them and we're doing all those kinds of things with parenting, that's one thing. But when they're older, we're almost just kind of coaching them through that dysregulation.
And almost, and in some cases, modeling, right? I think that your point about self-regulating first, and I would add to that for us to, as parents, call that out, right? Be transparent. Like, say out loud to my kid, I'm going to go take a walk, and it's because I know I'm here, and I need to get back here. And so how I'm going to self-regulate is going to take a walk. I think using the language with kids so that we're coaching, to your point, but we're also modeling, right? And, oh, by the way, now this is what it looks like when you actually do it. So, Michelle, so what I have lingering then in my head is so much of what we've talked about, like we've said, is really just kind of good parenting. It's good stuff to know to be able to support your kid regardless. How does it go from that to I have a kid who has experienced serious trauma, has a higher ACE number, if you will, etc. What are the things that then become important for adults who are supporting kids in that situation? What do you add on to the parenting strategies that you usually talk about?
I think the most important thing for any child is one stable connection with a caring adult.
Okay.
So they have to have that. So, when you have a child that has had lots of trauma and lots of stress, multiple caregivers, or if they're passed around between multiple people, can be very impacting. So helping a child have that stable, caring relationship with one adult.
Okay.
Yeah.
It is so very, very important. And that will help work through those things that will regulate them.
Okay.
Like we've been talking about all along, those regulation tools.
Okay.
But you've got to have that one stable, caring adult.
Okay.
Is critical.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So at what point then as a parent do I know it's time to reach out for more help?
I think when your stress level starts going up,
okay,
and you're recognizing your own stress going higher, that's a point to call in for reinforcements, okay, whether that be through your friends, your family, or if it's a time to go seek some professional support.
Okay.
And that can be a variety of ways. Maybe, you need to have a psychiatrist or a psychologist or a social worker or a counselor, or, looking for alternatives.
Okay.
Like Lisa and I have talked about swimming. Maybe it's time to join the swim team. Maybe it's time to, go into horseback riding. To look for other avenues to help with that rhythmic activity can be one way to start decreasing that stress response that you're getting.
Okay.
But I think when you become heightened in your stress, it just will heighten the stress of your child. And it's important to recognize that, of how you can get outside supports at that point.
So we also kind of teach our parents about the idea of, with mental health specifically, you're looking at frequency, intensity, and duration.
Okay.
So if concerns are occurring frequently and they're high intense and it's been going on for a little while, then you probably need to reach out and seek some additional support.
Okay.
The other important piece about that is when you're dealing with kids that have trauma histories, you have to build what Dr. Perry calls a therapeutic web. So it's not just about I'm going to receive outpatient counseling and med management. It's I'm going to receive outpatient counseling and med management, and I'm also going to engage in swimming and horseback riding and a drum circle, and I'm going to talk to the different people that are involved about my child has experienced some trauma, and this is how we're working with them to get through this process, so that you're really building on a variety of ways to manage that brain dysregulation.
Okay. So what I appreciate about that is it's showing, it really emphasizes that you could think of it as simple, like the things that you've shared with us today are things that, feel very doable, but it's not easy, right? Because sometimes we think, oh, when it's time to bring in the reinforcements, as Michelle said, and now we're going to go see a counselor, now somebody else is solving this. But no, that's not the case at all, right? What we're doing is partnering with somebody who's helping us, but we still have to, like you said, it's not about now you have therapy once a week and a med, this is great, you're going to be fine. It's about that's helping support you while we do all these other things, right? All the like you said, joining the swim team, and we're engaging in the regulation activities, and we're doing all those things. It's a partnership, not a, oh good, I get to turn it over to someone else. Not that anybody would think about their kid that way, but you do when you've been in it long enough and you're exhausted from the supporting that you've already done. It's certainly easy to see why you could fall into that. Okay.
And what the brain science is telling you is that sometimes those things, like the pattern rhythm movements, the swimming and the horseback riding and all of those kinds of things, if you haven't worked on those things and then you go to outpatient counseling, you're not ready to do the work.
Ah, nice. Okay.
You're building developmentally. So just like when you have that infant and you're developing empathy, you develop empathy to begin with through rocking.
Right.
So if you don't have those experiences, then you're going to struggle to develop what you need to do. So those somatosensory activities in some ways are the building blocks to be able to do the clinical work when you're ready.
Okay.
So it's important to do every day. It's important to have those kinds of activities and continue them.
And kind of like we've said already, right? Especially given our current circumstances, we're all dealing with a heightened level of stress and a whole new reality that 2 weeks ago we had no idea was going to exist for us. So it's a really powerful time to start thinking about it and thinking about how you might implement some of them. And it makes me think too, we've kind of touched on this a couple of times this morning, that regardless of what's happened, right? Because I'm really thinking about that list you started out with, Michelle, and I just think that we'd be hard pressed for anyone to say, no, none of that has ever happened to me, right? Or that's never been a part of my life. So when you think about that, it really does start to become about life is hard, right? And it's harder for some than others. And we can experience the same thing, and it could still be harder for me than it was for you because of it's about my experience. So as I think about right now, we're living in a world where we're all experiencing a common stressor, and we're going to experience it in very different ways because it's going to be a heck of a lot more stressful for people who are living in hotel rooms right now than it is for me sitting in my house, right? As an example. If you think about that, I always appreciate, well, first off, I appreciate that this is just our first conversation because there's so much more. So thank goodness for that. But as we kind of try and bring the conversation, at least in this first part around parents, to a close, and we consider the current circumstances we're in, right? I always like to give our guests the last word. So I'll start with you, Michelle, and then go to you, Lisa. Like, what are you most worried about right now for kids? And what can we, and by we I mean whether I'm supporting my own kids or just being more observant of the people around me, right? What can we do to pay attention and make sure we're a support however we can be?
I think the biggest thing that I would recognize that I think we need to be doing is making sure that it's our job to keep them calm.
Okay.
As a parent, as an adult, they can't join our chaos in any way. They cannot, yes, we might be stressed and they may pick up on that, but we need to make sure that we're trying to find ways to lessen that, whether it be through nutrition or exercise or just having fun. I think that's the other piece that we can get so caught up in. You know, if you watch the news all day long, it's going to freak you out.
Absolutely.
And, you know, being okay to turn off the TV and do something else. You know, and just making sure that you're taking care of yourself and taking care of your kids the way you're supposed to. I mean, unfortunately, I was the bad parent last night and wouldn't let my kid go spend the night somewhere. Oh, well. Like, I mean, that's okay.
Taking care of them.
That is okay. But having to be the bad parent isn't always the greatest feeling.
Yeah.
And so it's okay to be that way right now, but it's also just important to remember to be calm and factual, because I think sometimes kids can hear things or they see things that may not be true, and making sure that you're making them feel safe is very, very important. And that is your job as the parent, is to be the safe space and to make things safe for them. But it can be hard, like Lisa's talking about earlier, about just, you know, this is something new for a 15-year-old. It's not fun. You know, their job right now is to be with their friends, and you're saying, I'm sorry, you can't do that. But trying to come up with ways and things you can do that are kind of outside the box right now to have some fun are important.
Okay. And I think too, I would add to that, just acknowledging for them, right? Yeah, you're supposed to be with your friends right now. 100%, you're right. And this is completely derailing what the 15-year-old is supposed to do right now. And yet we're going to stay safe by doing it this way. So, I mean, I think that's an important piece. So, Lisa, how about you? What would you add?
Yeah, I mean, I think right now we just have to recognize that we're all stressed.
Yeah.
So, you know, our families that are stressed even more on a daily basis, that stress has become intense and complex.
Yes.
And so right now it has to be about meet the basic needs.
Yeah.
And then figure out some way to establish some kind of routine. Go back to the way you behaved when they were infants.
Yeah.
And come up with that routine and structure that, and it needs to build in fun. It needs to build in comfort, those kinds of activities. So, you know, have a time where you take a walk every day. Have a time where you play a game, or have a time where you sit on the couch and snuggle every day. But to build those kinds of activities into your day right now are extremely important. And then keep that routine. You know, get up at the same time, eat at the same time, go to bed at the same time, whatever that is. It can be different than it would be normally,
of course,
because, you know, the world's different. But what is your general structure going to be like?
Yeah.
We have to build that empathetic envelope for our kids, and so parents have to do that. Recognizing that I'm dysregulated, taking care of myself is extremely important right now as a parent, and then you can take care of your kids.
That makes perfect sense. All right, ladies, thank you so much for joining us today, as I said, and we're going to look forward to picking up the conversation, thinking in terms of schools the next time we talk. So good luck there in your own homes with your own self-regulation and the regulation of your children that we're all trying to do right now, and we'll talk to you really soon, okay?
All right, thanks. Bye.
All right, Melissa, I don't know about you, but my head is spinning. There are so many, right, important pieces here. Oh, my gosh. So I'm going to point out a couple, and then I'm going to turn it over to you because I want to hear your insights and your thinking about it. But everything from that first thing that hits me, of course, is that whole ACE thing, right? The adverse childhood experiences, rather, and that assessment. And when Lisa talks about that, and she talks about this idea, and she puts an emphasis on this idea of one size fits one mentality.
Yes.
So I had a very personal reaction to that because it really validated my own way of thinking. So as someone who experienced severe childhood trauma, and I did, I'll share that I actually went back online to take that ACE assessment after I talked with them because I thought, all right, I'm just kind of curious. And Michelle and Lisa shared that a score of 3 to 4 or higher is indicative of someone who's experienced trauma at a high level. And my score was a 6. Frankly,
wow.
Frankly, it was It probably could have been higher, but like the questions are, they pose the questions like often, right? Like this type of thing happened often. And so in that case, there were some kinds where I was like, well, maybe not often. So I said no. So it could be higher than a 6. But my point is that even though some terrible things happened to me as a kid, I've never played the compare game. Somehow, intuitively, I've always known that, it's not about what happened to me being worse than what happened to you, right? As I hear other people recant their experiences, that, I might, in my mind, I might actually think, well, I mean, frankly, that's not so bad. Let me tell you what happened to me. But what Lisa did was really couch that for me of, it's not about what happened, it's about how you experienced it. And I guess I've intuitively known that because it's never been one's worse than the other. It's been your experience is your experience. The most traumatic thing that ever happened to you is your biggest trauma, not compared to me, right? It is our own thing. So for me, that was a really key piece of learning to take away. So let me hear from you. I want to hear some of the things that really grabbed you.
Well, I will say, Janice, that just hearing you just now, I hadn't really thought about the comparative piece of it. I know that, and especially in a world driven by social media, there is this need to compare oneself to others.
Right.
And it's what we've always, said, the oppression Olympics or the trauma Olympics or the, whatever. And it's not an Olympic sport. It is this one size fits one, smacked me right in the face, punched me in the gut, settled in my heart. And I was just like, wow, I had never heard that, thought of that, understood that. And I don't think Michelle or Lisa have any idea how powerful that was for us or for the listening, how it's going to be for the listening audience. That is such a key thing to understand.
Agreed.
And so I'm with you. That's probably the thing that I take away from this most. But right up there next to it, Janice, is this idea that trauma has not one definition.
Right.
For me, like going into this interview, I really thought, I'll listen. I'm sure I'll learn some things.
Sure. But
I don't really have anything traumatic. I don't know any, at least no one's ever shared their trauma with me. Like, because in our minds, I think we all think trauma has to be some huge, horrific event.
Exactly.
Like Lisa said, the event. And it's not the event.
Yeah.
It could be something that I would look at and think, okay, no big deal. But to someone else, it could be very traumatic based on their experiences. And so, in a sense, not to water it down in any way, but we all could be suffering from trauma. Absolutely. And not even realize it because we've normalized so many things that really, we've got this idea you got to buck up, you got to deal with it. But trauma is real, and we have to acknowledge, accept, and then work with that, not around it, but we got to work through it. And so that was a big, big thing for me in that, trauma can be many things. Yeah. And it is that one fits one mentality. Yeah. So that was really, really huge for me. And then the other thing that was huge for me was the idea that they work under the assumption that everybody benefits from having trauma awareness. Yep. Everybody. Yeah. So we're not going to just focus on the kids who've been traumatized or the parents of kids who've been traumatized. Everybody is going to get this work, as we tend to say. Yeah. Everybody to get this work, and it'll benefit everybody in some way. So that's what I'm hoping that this podcast will do, is reach everybody. Yeah. So that we all start operating under the assumption that everybody's, and we say it all the time, everybody's dealing with something. Yep. Everybody has a story. But I don't think we think that could be going through trauma. Like Janice, I never would have known, and I don't know your story. I never would have guessed that you'd gone through something traumatic. Yeah. Ever. Yeah. Yeah. Ever. Absolutely. Because when you already know, and I say this every show, I think you're amazing. Oh. And I think that, which is why I keep bringing you back, because you keep saying it. I think, but it's the truth. Like you do amazing work, and not just It's not to benefit you. The work
Right.
you do is always to benefit others in your education career, in your faster way work, in this podcast. It's always about serving other people. And sometimes we think, oh, her life must have been wonderful because she's so loving and she's so caring and she's taking care of other people. So this is proof positive that we don't know people's stories.
Yeah.
And so we should handle everybody with the assumption that they are working through something or going through something.
Yeah.
And so this drove that home for me more than I think either one of them could understand.
Well, I'm so glad to hear you say that, because I felt the same way as they talked, and you're right. That is, and certainly as an educator, that is one thing. And having gone through my own experience, knowing that, you know, if you went back to anybody I went to school with, nobody would say that they, you know. So because we're really good about covering it up, right? I mean, we're really good about playing the part. We're really good about all those things, and quite frankly, as we get into this 4-part series, I made a deliberate decision for now that I didn't, and I've actually tried to make this true of all the episodes we've done so far, that it's not about me, right? It would be easy, right, to make it about me. So I've tried really hard not to, and I know that, you know, who knows, down the road at some point maybe that will be an important thing to share. But for now, you know, when we get to episode 3 and episode 4 of this 4-part series, we're going to be talking to a mom and subsequently her now adult daughter who experienced trauma. And yeah, I could have told my own story, but for now, I don't want to make it about me per se.
I get that.
But
and that's just another testament to why you're amazing, because you have a platform that you could very easily make about you. I listen to podcasts all the time that are that way.
Yeah.
So the fact that you're not doing that is commendable to me.
Thank you.
And I'm here if you ever decide you want to share your experience.
Yeah.
But I'm here if you don't.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't change who Janice is or Janice's impact at all.
That.
And so I just wanted you to know that this podcast is making a huge difference in lives. And I don't care if it's just my life.
Right.
It's making a difference.
Let's keep it real. It is about us.
Yeah. Every week, though, I walk away from this podcast learning.
Good.
I absolutely do every week. And
well, you and me both. So
yeah, and this week was so like I can't even find the words, which is strange because I'm never speechless.
My goal has been reached.
Yeah, and I want to say too to Michelle and Lisa, thank you.
Yeah.
For the work that you're doing.
Yeah.
Spotsylvania is home for us.
Amen.
And so to know that the work that they do in the home community, it's heartwarming.
Yeah.
And I want to sincerely thank them for that. I knew Michelle was doing social work, but I had no idea it was at this level. And this is commendable and fills me with gratitude for the both.
Yeah, I got to tell you, me too, and they both, and Michelle especially, she got into this work because of her work with the homeless population, and right now, hearing some of her stories about what's happening there during this pandemic is scary. But you said a couple of things that, really, strike home, I think, that are really important, and one of them is that idea that what's so important about what they said about treating everybody as if they have is because you will never know 90%, and the practices that you use to support kids who've experienced trauma are exactly the same kind of practices we should be using with kids, period, right? So, and they tie it, one of the other things that was a takeaway for me was the brain research that they referenced, right? Because when they talked about how many kids who've experienced trauma, they experience in the years of like 0 to 3 years old. So they'll never be able to articulate it to people, and yet it resides in their brains, and it impacts the way that their brains develop, right? So for them to talk about, in schools, we refer to it as social emotional learning, or SEL, right? And more, and we'll talk about this next week, schools are being tasked with social emotional learning for kids. But without a background, it's easy to hear that expression or that term and to think to yourself, oh, that's very touchy-feely. Oh, it's all about the emotional, etc. But yet now, but because of Lisa and Michelle, we know there's a huge body of research around the brain, right?
Absolutely.
But what's powerful about that, and what I loved about it, is that what they spent most of their time doing, as they talked about the classes that they provide for parents in the community there, is showing us that even with that, we can control, right? We can control how a kid then moves forward, right? We can help a child rewire their brain, the parts that were damaged, if you will, from traumatic experiences. So the work that they're doing with parents, of course, is huge. And again, like I said, it's like rewiring the thinking and learning of so many households that eventually it's going to impact an entire community. And I got to tell you, when she said trauma-informed community, I was like, hallelujah, because frankly, it can't just be schools, right? It has to be all of us.
Or the home itself, or even just the home. Like that expression, it takes a village, is even more so true in a traumatic situation. If the kid is getting what they need at the home, but then they go to school and they don't get it, or vice versa, then it's not going to be productive. So we absolutely have to. It has to be the whole community that is aware and practicing and thoughtful. Yep. Absolutely so.
So I'm excited to see how their work continues, because right now, obviously, they're doing a bang-up job in schools and in these parent classes. And they're in a community, our home community, where they've said, we want to be a trauma-informed community. So we're going to be keeping a close eye. So, folks, if you are someone you know needs more resources, I do encourage you to visit some of the websites that we're going to include on our episode notes, and to certainly reach out to key agencies in your own community for more help. And I've asked this before, and I'm going to say it again. This 4-part series is going to be this is going to be more important for this 4-part series, that is, than ever before. Please hit share. I mean, getting this message, getting this learning out to as many folks as possible is critical. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. Be one of the first who gets the next episode. Like the Facebook page. Do all the things. But more than anything, share. So that, Melissa, go ahead.
Sorry to cut you off. But even if it's not something that you personally feel you benefit from, whether it's this episode or any other, like, I can be honest, as I stated a little earlier, when I went into this episode, I went into it thinking, okay, I'll learn a little bit about trauma, but I never imagined that it would have the impact on me that it did. So, you may not get that same impact, but if you share it, you have no idea who amongst your friends or family or just your social media circle might benefit from it. And it costs you nothing to share. It's not, we're not sponsored. It's not making money for anybody. It is literally just sharing information in the hopes that it will help our worldwide community.
Yeah, that's it. Thank you for that. So next week, folks, let's take a quick sneak peek. We've already kind of alluded to it, but episode 10, we're going to pick up on our conversation with Lisa and Michelle to dig into how then schools can support children who've experienced trauma. We'll find some similarities, no doubt about that, of course, but I got to say, as an educator, I can see the faces of kids I've worked with over the years, and this learning already has me thinking, okay, so was there trauma there, right, that I didn't even recognize? And did I factor it into my support or didn't I, right? And that's the stuff. The hard part about learning is you think back to the things you've done and you think, okay, I did that wrong. And now I've got to, let myself feel guilty, give myself some grace for it and move forward with what I do know. But I do know that from my daily work with schools now, that this topic of trauma is a significant reality for them, both before COVID and certainly it's going to be during and after COVID. So my educator peeps especially, be sure to tune in next week and we'll get to it.